You found the skeleton. How would you tell it's a dinosaur? You personally, how would you decide?
Well, interesting question. I don't know. I'd have to do some research on that.
Jankoro nazami ngita. Kiri domo. Taji. Jan ohawa oni domo hawajaga. You must be Dapper's friends. But Dapper will be back, and I am only here for a short time. He said you might be by, and that I might need to explain to you that pseudoscience is very dumb and has serious deadly consequences. I was once caught up in religious fervor that made me accept things that science said were wrong. So I understand how it feels. But pseudoscience is used to support things like vaccine hesitancy, which kills people. Both those who refuse the vaccine as well as those who cannot take it and so rely on herd immunity. It can lead to things like irrational theocratic rule, as I know too well. It can even lead to violence against innocent people. The person I'm here to talk about, Casey Luskin, is supporting autocratic rule in one of the larger of your nation states. In fact, the one with the most of your primitive weapons. That makes him an existential threat to your species, and some of the pseudoscience he spreads is misinformation about evolution, including the evolution of humans. When you left off with Dapper, Luskin was pretending that all the late hominids were in the same species by calling the variation between them microevolution. Of course, he never bothered to give any reasons to say that they are all in the same species, beyond his gut telling him. As someone who has seen a lot of guts, let me tell you, they are not very smart. But anyway, I suppose I should let the small monkey who pretends to be not a monkey talk.
What I would say, there's a good quote from one scientist who called it the effects of size variation, climatic stress, genetic drift, and differential expression of common genes.
That is simply a list of things that cause evolution. You cannot point to that and then pretend that that is somehow a problem for evolution. That would be like saying that reports of heavy rain in a region are a problem for mudslides in the area. They go together.
So these are small-scale changes.
None of that means that the changes were small-scale. Even the differential expression of common genes, which seems minor, can cause major differences. The developmental genes between humans and insects are almost all shared, and it is the differential expression that is the cause of most of the morphological difference between them. Even if he quoted someone accurately, which we cannot say because he keeps refusing to cite his sources, that would not mean that the changes are small.
Now what about intelligent design? Well, I work with Stephen Meyer at Discovery Institute.
I see we get a name when it is someone who agrees with him. How very convenient. Also, I have been informed by Mr. Dapper that Stephen Meyer is a hack fraud, and he asked me to remind you that he has a whole series explaining that fact.
And he has written a paper which talks about how intelligent design provides a sufficient causal explanation for the origin of large amounts of information.
No one has ever, to my knowledge, disagreed that intelligent agents can and do produce information by whatever definition we want to use. The problem is twofold. First, Meyer is working on a solution in search of a problem. There is no need for an intelligent agent to explain evolutionary biology. The known mechanisms for evolution are adequate to produce whatever kind of information a pseudoscientist cares to complain about. The second problem is that he has no scientific evidence for the actual action or existence of an intelligent agent involved in producing information under any definition in biology. His ideas fail the basic test of Occam's razor, and they even worse suggest no new avenues for research.
And that the intelligent design of a blueprint often precedes the assembly of parts in accord with a preconceived design plan.
That is indeed how humans and elites make things. But evolution can be watched in real time, and it is known that that is not how evolution works. I do not even know if this is supposed to be an argument.
In other words, intelligent agents typically design things fully formed and ready to operate in the world. And this could be reflected as the abrupt appearance of new types of organisms in the fossil record.
Oh, I see the logic, or attempts at it here. Because all lineages have a first representation, and that is not going to be the absolute start of their evolution, he has for no reason other than his own bias assumed that there was no prior evolution. Instead, it was just intelligent design. The only way for this to be even close to rational would be if he had reason to think that the fossil record preserved nearly every species that has ever existed, and that nearly all of those have been described by scientists. Since neither of those things is true, this is nonsense.
So a quick summary of the fossil section. Hominid fossils generally fit into two categories, ape-like and human-like species.
As Dapper has already indicated, none of them are ape-like, they are all 100% apes. And there is indeed a smooth transition, and Luskin had to rely on sources that were usually some 3 or more decades old in order to make the case that there is some break between Australopithecus and Homo. There is none, to the degree that it is not even clear where to draw the line that separates Australopithecus and Homo.
With a large, unbridged gap between them.
Except that organisms like Australopithecus sediba, Homo habilis, and early Homo erectus easily bridge that gap.
This morphological discontinuity reflects a genetic revolution or, a Big Bang model of human origins.
Perhaps 3 decades ago that was true, but the intervening years have provided evidence of a very smooth transition, which of course is why Luskin relies on outdated sources. If he did not, then he would have no sources. Although, given his habit of not actually citing sources, I am not sure why he does not simply make everything up. On the other hand, making things up is exactly the whole point of the Discovery Institute, and Luskin does his share at this.
The genus Homo appears abruptly in the fossil record in a manner that challenges standard Darwinian explanations for the origin of our species, and a Big Bang model requires the rapid origin of new genetic information.
Who has taught you these lies?
And that information is best explained by design.
In the words of Dapper Dinosaur, citation needed. Nothing Luskin has said has in any way indicated any need for an intelligent designer. Indeed, even if there were a large gap between the earliest and later hominins, that would not be evidence of intelligent design. Rapid evolution is not impossible, nor do we expect a complete fossil record. Indeed, even the people whom he did not cite, but whose claims from decades ago he pirated, would agree that their work even at the time was in no way a problem for evolution or indicative of intelligent design in human ancestry.
So now we're going to talk about human genetics. How many of you have ever heard that old argument that we are 99% genetically similar to a chimp, and that shows that we share a common ancestor, okay?
I assume everyone is familiar with this, but it is the similarity in alignable coding regions, and it has never been pretended otherwise by scientists. Further, it is not that some particular high number indicates evolution. Rather, it is the pattern with chimpanzees and bonobos being closer to each other than any other species, then with that group being closer to humans than to other groups, then gorillas being closer to the chimp and human group than to orangutans, and all great apes being closer to each other than hylobatids, and so on. It is the nested nature of the genetic similarity. Under separate ancestry, just math would indicate that humans should be closest to some other species, but separate ancestry cannot account for the nested pattern that is seen in primates and the rest of life.
I've certainly heard this argument.
It is less of an argument and more of a simple fact.
And you guys also watch Bill Nye the Science Guy. He wrote in his book a few years ago that as our understanding of DNA has increased, we have come to understand that we share around 98.8% of our gene sequence with chimpanzees. And he says this is striking evidence for chimps and chumps to have a common ancestor. Well, last year in August, I was at the Smithsonian Institution Museum of Natural History, and it said exactly the same thing.
In the words of Yap Yap the Destroyer, get on with it.
You and chimpanzees, 98.8% genetically similar.
In alignable coding regions.
And I'll just give you the punchline ahead of time. This is simply not true, that we are 98.8% genetically similar.
Yes, it is.
So 2 questions. Is it true that we are 98.8% genetically similar to chimps? No, we'll get to that.
It is true within the margin of error for alignable coding regions. But that is not the only way to measure genetic similarity. And it is true that when measured in other ways, the percent similarity goes down. But it also goes down similarly when comparing humans to any other organism, and the nested pattern predicted by evolution remains in place, which was always the actual evidence, not some particular number on a statistic. Figuring out the percent similarity in the genomes of 2 species under any given measurement technique is just one bit of data. It takes more data to actually mean anything. Now, it is remarkable how close humans are to the members of genus Pan, being closer than tigers and lions, which some creationists think are the same species because of their ability to interbreed. If lions and tigers constitute one species, then it would seem that humans, chimpanzees, and bonobos should as well. Oddly, though, it seems that none of these dishonorable dogs ever bother to make that argument. Instead, they prefer to be dogmatically incoherent, and without any standards except that which enables their lives is good, and that which does not is bad. And all in the service of oppressing their fellow humans for trivial reasons such as whom those humans engage in romantic and sexual interactions with, or which gods they follow, or even what color they are. Remember, this is not just about science. It is about the life and death of members of your species, and even of the species as a whole. Back when I was deluded by false promises, as Luskin is, I would have considered him a useful idiot, helping destroy humanity from within as I foolishly tried to do from the outside.
And question 2, does it matter? Does this even mean anything, our percent similarity to chimps?
On its own, no, it does not. But when taken together with other such measurements, it places humans squarely in a part of the tree of life in the same way that Luskin would place organisms whose common ancestry he does not object to. The same techniques that we use to determine that all bears share common ancestry, and which bears are most closely related to others, when used on humans and the rest of the apes, put humans firmly as the sister group among extant apes to one subset of great ape diversity. So in that sense, yes, it matters immensely, although the particular number does not.
So, soon after the chimp genome was sequenced in 2005, there was an article in the journal Science, one of the top scientific journals, titled The Myth of 1%. And this article basically said that this idea that we are 1% genetically different from chimps is a myth and a truism that should be retired.
This is a reference to a non-peer-reviewed one-page article by Jake Cohen published in 2007. It notes, as I already have, that the 1% number only accounts for one type of measurement, and notes that other measurements such as gene copy number, or trying to account for indels, will decrease the percent similarity number. It is about where among the differences between chimpanzees and humans one can look to find what makes the species so different, despite being so similar genetically. It in no way raises any problems for human evolution, nor does it even dispute the 1% figure. Rather, the myth, as asserted by Cohen, is that the difference can be easily found in that 1% figure that only counts single-base substitutions.
Differences actually include at least, this is actually more than this, but they said in this paper, 35 million base pair changes, 5 million indels in each species. Those are base pair differences that are greater than one base pair, and 689 extra genes in human. That 99% similarity pertains only to certain alignable proteins.
No, it applies to genes, not proteins. In fact, since it is restricted to coding regions, the protein similarity would have to be higher, since not all genetic variation in protein coding sequence will even result in a difference in the amino acid sequence of the resultant protein. Luskin is just lying again.
Okay? But many non-protein coding sequences are highly dissimilar. They may be so dissimilar you can't even align them to make a comparison of how similar they are. They're non-alignable.
Yes, because such sequences include junk DNA, which will accumulate mutations much faster because it is not under purifying selection. This is a prediction of evolutionary biology and population genetics, not a problem for it. Simply pointing out something that is true and predicted by a theory, but doing so with an ominous tone, is not an argument against the theory. It is still just someone showing evidence for the theory, but doing so with incredulity.
So I would say that the best estimates of human-chimp genetic similarity show that we are much less than 98% genetically similar.
Best for what purpose, though? Best for estimating whether or not a human drug will work on a chimpanzee in a veterinary setting? Best for estimating divergence time between humans and chimps? Best for helping Luskin hold on to his pseudoscientific dogma? Well, we know he will be using that last definition, and so for him, whatever is best is whatever gets the lowest number, because he seems to mistakenly believe that if the estimate falls below some arbitrary threshold, then that will negate all the evidence of chimp and human common ancestry. It will not, and I cannot tell if he knows that and is lying, or if he is just that foolish.
There's a paper in the journal Frontiers in Genetics in 2020 which said that we are 96% similar genetically to a chimp. However, this paper did not look at centromeric DNA and much non-coding DNA, which would lower the percent similarity.
Yes, because such DNA is known to accumulate mutations faster and so loses its phylogenetic signal faster, meaning it is harder to get good statistical information about phylogenetics from such DNA. But also, we are back to Luskin simply asserting that some paper said something. The problem is that a paper published in a journal once pointed out that a buccal swab from Casey Luskin was indistinguishable from a surface sample of a toilet seat in the last stall of a dive bar men's room attached to a gas station. It must be true. A paper said it. Except, oh, wait, that might be made up, and the only easy way to tell is if I bother to cite which paper it was, where it was published, and when. Of course, I will not do that, and so my claim has just as much validity as his when he does not cite a source. We saw him cite a source with his friend Meyer. Why can he not do it in this case? I can only assume because the paper does not, in fact, support his skepticism of human and chimp common ancestry.
Another informal study by a Christian biologist named Stephen Schaffner said we're 95% similar.
Interestingly, Stephen Schaffner of MIT is a signatory to the Project Steve statement. It is a response to similar lists of supposed doubters of evolution. It is only open to scientists whose name is derived from the Greek word Stephanos, meaning crown. It includes names such as Stephen, Stephan, and Stephanie. The statement is as follows. Quote, evolution is a vital, well-supported, unifying principle in the biological sciences, and the scientific evidence is overwhelmingly in favor of the idea that all living things share a common ancestry. Although there are legitimate debates about the patterns and processes of evolution, there is no serious scientific doubt that evolution occurred or that natural selection is a major mechanism in its occurrence. It is scientifically inappropriate and pedagogically irresponsible for creation of pseudoscience, including but not limited to intelligent design, to be introduced into the science curricula of our nation's public schools. End quote. I do not think that Schaffner would agree that his different measurement techniques is a problem for the universal consensus that humans and chimpanzees share a common ancestor.
I think one of the best studies was done by a British geneticist named Richard Buggs. Actually, this was an informal study. It's not been published in a peer-reviewed journal yet.
Then it is just some guy saying a thing that we cannot even check on because it is not in the literature yet, so I will skip it. This is as useful as asking a grunt about my family history.
So whatever the final answer is going to be, I would predict it's going to be somewhere between 85 and 95%.
There is no final answer because multiple techniques all give similarities between different things, and so they are all right. There is no one simple answer to how similar humans and chimps are, as said in his own source by Cohen in Science. The last paragraph quotes someone whose name I cannot begin to know how to pronounce as saying, quote, "I don't think there's any way to calculate a number," end quote, in response to the question, quote, "Could researchers combine all of what's known and come up with a precise percentage difference between humans and chimpanzees?" End quote.
However, we need to understand that all current estimates depend on what actually the NIH calls humanized versions of the chimp genome that used human DNA as a scaffolding when they built their drafts of the chimp genome.
Not since 2018 when Pantro 6, a whole pan troglodytes genome was published, which did not rely on Homo sapiens scaffold. And you may not be surprised to learn that it did not overturn previous percentages, because the genomes that were scaffolded with human DNA as a template were virtually identical to the ones that were made without such a crutch. And why was such scaffolding done in the first place? Because of the known similarity between humans and chimpanzees. And the fact that so little about the chimpanzee genome changed when this was done away with is yet more evidence that evolution is correct, because it is a confirmed prediction of evolutionary biology.
So these versions of the chimp genome are more similar to humans than they really actually should be.
That would be the prediction that one would make based on Luskin's belief that humans and chimpanzees do not share common ancestry. Unfortunately for him, we already know that his prediction was not borne out. Now, I do not know if this talk was given before or after 2018, so I will not blame him for not knowing about later chimpanzee whole genome sequences. But the fact remains that the prediction from evolution was confirmed, and the prediction from separate ancestry was in fact wrong.
But let's just take the highest estimate here, 96%. If we take 4% difference between humans and chimps, that still amounts to 120 million nucleotides that are different between humans and chimps. And let me tell you, that's a lot of DNA. That's plenty of DNA to encode many complex differences between humans and chimps.
Well, yes, the difference between humans and chimps comes down to the difference in their genetics. So of course the genetic differences is where the difference lies. This is almost tautological and not controversial.
But let's just say, for the sake of argument, that we are 99% similar to a chimp.
Which is not an overall difference number and never has been. I suppose I should explain. The genome can be thought of as a series of books, one for each chromosome. This makes it surprisingly analogous to a book like a human Bible. Suppose I took a human Bible, perhaps a new revised standard version, then randomly I inserted chunks of randomly generated texts, and then made a copy of my new extra nonsense version of the Bible. Then I take the two copies and separate them out by book. Then, keeping them secret, I swap a few chapters here and there between them. Then I insert new bits of randomly generated text. Then, within each book, I swap around a few more chapters, but not the same ones between the two copies. Then I rebind them and ask you to give me a simple number for how similar they are on a range from 0 to 100. There simply is no single way to answer that, even though we can easily tell that they are fundamentally derived from the same text. Similarly, the human and chimp genomes have had genes shuffled around, both within and between chromosomes, and they both have junk DNA that they share in common with the common ancestor, and more that they do not. Therefore, there is no way to simply give a number that expresses the similarity overall.
I would then say, so what? Does that even make a difference in terms of making an argument for common ancestry?
No, the number on its own does not matter. It is the pattern from across the tree of life that matters. No 1% similarity value based on any technique means much. That is how theories work. They connect otherwise unrelated data within a framework that allows researchers to make predictions and explain the otherwise opaque patterns within the data.
Those similarities could be due to common descent. Yes, that is one way to look at it. But they could also be due to common design.
No, they cannot, and there is an important reason why not. That reason is junk DNA. That is, DNA without sequence restraint, and with no function beyond being a buffer for mutations. With sequence-constrained DNA, some mutations will not fix because they are deleterious, and therefore, despite the fact that the same gene will separately mutate without crossover between the populations after two species become reproductively isolated, the sequences still have a tendency to remain the same. And so if the species were similar in these regions because of common design, then the pattern we see in these regions between species can be accommodated by common design. But because there is no such selection pressure in junk DNA, then even if each species that is created separately starts with identical junk DNA regions, they will both separately accumulate mutations in these regions, which means that if the variation in such regions also lines up with the phylogenetic information from other sources such as morphology, paleontology, and the sequencing of coding DNA, then it cannot be explained by common design. It turns out this has already been tested with primates, and separate ancestry was overwhelmingly rejected with statistical significance that I have never seen in any biology study before. The study I rely on here is Statistical Evidence for Common Ancestry Application to Primates by Baum et al., published in Evolution in 2016.
Where we are built based upon a common blueprint. So I would say that there's really no objective standard here to infer common ancestry.
That is because he is lying. He is essentially ignoring everything about how common ancestry is inferred and instead is just whining like a struck jackal about percent similarity values he does not like. It is a fundamentally dishonest way to engage with the evidence. Essentially, it is not engaging with the evidence and instead doing something that gives the illusion of engaging with the evidence to lay people who do not know anything about evolutionary biology, in order to fool such people to further his oppressive and murderous ends.
And you can easily explain the similarities between organisms using common design. After all, designers will regularly reuse parts that work in different designs, right?
That is right, but that presents a problem. Organisms generally cannot simply use so-called designs from other organisms to solve similar problems. An obvious example is that there are 3 lineages of flying vertebrates from Earth: dinosaurs, pterosaurs, and mammals, with birds and their close relatives being the dinosaurs, and bats the mammals. While all of them use their forelimbs for flight, they do so in drastically different ways. A designer, according to this argument, would simply reuse the wing design. But in evolution, birds and bats could not look at each other or the earlier pterosaurs for a solution to the problem of flight. They evolved contingent and distinct anatomical changes to allow powered flight. Does this mean that they were designed by different designers? Well, if Luskin were being honest, then yes, it would. But because the designer he believes in is the god of his Christian religion, he cannot argue for different designers.
We reuse wheels on cars and airplanes. We reuse keyboards on both tablets and cell phones. So it's a very normal practice for computer programmers or engineers or designers to reuse parts that work in different designs.
Which is what we specifically do not see in life except in the most similar organisms, the ones that evolution also says should have such similarities. Meaning that in all cases, the evidence is either against common design and in favor of common ancestry, or it is not dispositive. This means that there is much evidence for the latter and none for the former.
So the fact that we have similarities, maybe even high similarities to other species, really does not challenge my questions about common ancestry. I think that common design upon a common blueprint can easily explain this.
If all we had to go on was just chimpanzees and humans, then I would agree. I do not think that we could distinguish between common design and common ancestry easily. But it is fortunate that we have many other organisms, and that with this large collection of organisms, we can indeed test that, and have. And the data overwhelmingly reject common design, and are only compatible with common ancestry when treated as a whole.
But if we were to take 4% of our DNA and change it, that can actually lead to huge differences.
Well, yes, it depends on which 4%, but of course it can cause significant change.
I took the famous quote from Empire Strikes Back where Darth Vader confesses to Luke that he is Luke's father, and I just inserted 4 instances of the word not, changing about 4% of these words.
If Darth Vader were real, I would vanquish him on my blade, and I would do the same to Sheev Palpatine, and after that, I assure you, he would not return somehow.
And it totally changes the meaning. Now he says, I am not your father. Search your feelings. You know it to be true. Luke, you cannot destroy the Emperor. He has foreseen this. It is your destiny. Join me together. We cannot rule the galaxy as father and son. Come with me. It is not the only way. So changing just a small percentage of a text can lead to dramatically different meanings.
Does Luskin think that the consensus position is that chimpanzees and humans are essentially identical? I can assure him that that is not the position of any geneticist or other scientist that I am aware of.
So the question that I like to ask is, let's say we do have that 120 million nucleotide base pair differences between human and chimp DNA. Is there enough time in the fossil record to evolve that degree of a difference? And I would say the answer is no.
Well, the answer is yes. First, when the populations that would lead to modern humans and modern chimpanzees separated, they would not have been identical anyway. That is because of the founder effect. Further, that 120 million is really more like 60 million because of the fact that mutations accumulate in both populations through time. Further, because of things like crossover events and sexual reproduction, these differences can be fixing in the genome in parallel throughout each population, so they do not need to happen in sequence. But the other thing is that this is just wrong. The number of actual positively selected genes in the human and chimp genome relative to each other has been measured multiple times, and the number is about 500 or so on the human side. But to be fair, that did not check regulatory sequences or all genes. So let's say we triple it to 1,500 to account for such missed regions under positive selection. Further, since we always strive to be generous to creationists, I will give it another order of magnitude. Now we are at 15,000. Now we have about 6 million years to get that, and we will assume an average generation time of 25 years, which is probably too long for the earliest hominins, but oh well. That means that there have been about 240,000 generations for humans to accumulate 15,000 beneficial traits compared to their common ancestor with chimpanzees. That means that on average, one of these traits fixed every 16 generations, or to put it in terms of Earth years, one every 400 or so years. This is plenty of time, and this is already absurdly generous to creationists with just giving them a free order of magnitude. Really, a more reasonable estimate would be about every 160 generations, or about 4,000 years, which is essentially nothing. This is evolution at a snail's pace compared to what we have seen in some instances in the wild and in the lab. As for the non-beneficial traits, well, those can build up largely unhindered and so can have a much faster accumulation time. And of course, large-scale changes like the fusion of ape chromosomes 2A and 2B can happen in a single generation, but represent a huge alleged difference depending on the measurement technique. So once again, we bump up against the problem that you cannot simply assign a percent similarity to the genome as a whole, and then use that number to calculate the number of mutations that separate chimpanzees and humans from their most recent common ancestor. So there is plenty of time for humans to evolve from their common ancestor with chimps, which is why if you try to say otherwise to any paleoanthropologist or evolutionary biologist, they will look at you as if you had 3 heads before sticking a plasma grenade to your torso for your insolence.
According to a paper that was published in the journal Nature in 2004, if you wanted to convert an ape-like ancestor into human, you have to make all kinds of morphological changes.
Humans are morphologically unique. This is not news. But also, according to a 2005 paper in the journal Science, Casey Luskin spends all day rubbing baby oil on his nipples at P. Diddy's house. Or maybe it is a made-up paper. Who can say? But I can say that Casey Luskin should actually cite papers rather than just alluding to them.
You need a new design of a spine, a new shape and tilt to the pelvis, legs that angle in from the hips, knees, feet, and toes that were designed for upright walking, a skull that sits on top of the spine in a balanced position, a shift in jaw muscles and muscle attachments, and changes in skull shape and size, and many, many other changes as well.
Well, there is good news, brothers. What Casey is asking for has been provided by Australopithecus afarensis in everything but perhaps the jaw muscles, which are much more modern by the time we get to animals like Homo habilis and Homo erectus. So while he is not wrong that such morphological change is needed, it evidently happened, and we have the evidence for it right in the ground and in museums.
So the question is there enough time for all these genetic and morphological differences to evolve since we last shared a common ancestor with chimpanzees? So what are the relevant factors in such a calculation? Well, we're going to look at things like the population size. A larger population gives you more opportunities for those mutations to arise to get all those genetic differences.
That's true.
Generation time. A shorter generation time is going to give you more generations, and you're going to get more opportunities for all those mutational differences to arise.
This is also true.
Mutation rate. A higher mutation rate is going to give you, again, more mutations, more opportunities for all those differences to arise.
This again is strictly true, although at very high levels with an already very fit population, it will cause a decline in population fitness if the mutation rate is too high, because most mutations that have any effect on fitness will tend to cause a loss of fitness. And with a very high mutation rate, each new individual has a very high chance of being lower in fitness than its parents.
And then, of course, the time available from the fossil record. More time gives you more opportunities for those differences to arise. Well, in each of these cases, the factors are working against the evolutionary process. The population size is thought to be very small, bad for evolution.
But not so small that one beneficial mutation fixing every 4 millennia or so is unrealistic, unless he would like to provide us with some math.
Generation time, very long, bad for evolution.
That has already been taken into account in our previous back-of-the-envelope calculations.
Mutation rate, very low, also bad.
I'm unaware of any study claiming that humans have a particularly low mutation rate. I believe he made this up.
And the time available from the fossil record is certainly less than 10 million years. I think that actually the most common estimates would be only 4 to 6 million years, since we supposedly shared a common ancestor with apes.
Well, you humans are still apes. I mean, just look at you. You are like hairless brutes with too many digits. But the consensus is much closer to 6 to 7 million years for the most recent common ancestor of modern humans and members of genus Pan, your closest living relatives. That is why I use 6 million years in my calculation.
But we can just say 10 million years for the sake of the argument. But you might think that's a long time, but that only equates to a few, maybe tens of thousands of generations over that time period.
No, if we assume a 25-year generation time, which is still likely far too long, given that early hominins probably reached sexual maturity much faster than modern humans, and had much shorter childhoods, that leaves us with 400,000 generations. Just to get to 99,999 generations over 10 million years, the largest number that could count as tens of thousands, the human generation time would have to be about 100 years. This is simple arithmetic. I was under the impression that this type of math is learned by humans at around 8 Earth years of age. There is simply no case to be made that it takes 100 years to go from a human female giving birth to a baby, who then takes 100 years to itself reproduce on average. And if I use a more reasonable interpretation of 30,000 years for what he means by a few tens of thousands of generations, then we get an average hominid generation time of 330 years or so. It is hard for me to believe that he is saying this and not lying. I doubt very much that Mr. Luskin cannot divide the number 10 million by 30,000.
So what this means is that evolution does not get very many quote-unquote rolls of the dice to get the right mutations to evolve new traits in a population of early hominids.
Yes, I suppose if we just blatantly lie about the conditions under which evolution must operate within your lineage, it would be implausible that it could operate. But if we were to perhaps not lie, then this is simply a non-issue.
Now, I'm sure that many of you have heard of Michael Behe.
Dapper has even spoken to him, although unfortunately the recording of that live stream has been deleted, and the channel owner did not allow mirrors, even partial mirrors.
Michael Behe published a paper years ago where he argued that it would be very difficult in multicellular organisms to evolve a very simple trait that just requires 2 mutations before giving you an advantage, okay? We're just talking about 2 mutations that have to be present before you get some advantage.
This is the so-called waiting time problem, and in order to come up with this as a problem, Behe and colleagues, or should I say co-conspirators, had to make numerous incorrect assumptions, such as that only one genetic sequence could perform the intended function, that mutations have to fix in sequence, and that shuffling and crossover events from sexual reproduction have no effect in this. All of those assumptions are false, and when you relax these obviously false assumptions, the waiting time problem disappears, like the population of Reach when it was glassed.
And some of Michael Behe's critics decided to try to refute him in the journal Genetics.
And some of Luskin's critics, not me obviously, tried to refute that he ages and drinks his own urine, but they failed. This does not mean that he does age and drink his own urine, but then I cannot say for sure that he does not. Once again, it seems like Luskin would be well served by citing his sources.
And this is one of those times where he was really glad to be refuted, because although they kind of quibbled with some of his math, they found that ultimately the math did not work in favor of evolution. And they found that to obtain only 2 simultaneous mutations via Darwinian evolution, quote, for humans with a much smaller effective population size, this type of change would take over 100 million years. And the critics admitted that this was very unlikely to occur on a reasonable timescale.
That sure would be compelling, except that since there is no citation, I have no way to say if this ever happened. I will say that when a friend of Dapper's channel, Zach B. Hancock, a professional population geneticist, tried to replicate the findings from various waiting time papers, he could not, and when he relaxed the obviously absurd assumptions, the waiting time problem completely disappeared, even though he did not relax one of the most absurd assumptions, that only a single particular nucleotide sequence could cause the required effect. I will make sure Dapper links to his video on the matter.
If any 2 of those 120 million base pair differences between humans and chimps, if just 2 of those are necessary to give us some trait where you don't get any advantage until both of those mutations are present, then it's virtually impossible for that trait to have arisen by unguided evolutionary mechanisms since we shared our common ancestor with apes, okay?
That is not okay, and is in fact completely wrong. In fact, when the simulations are run, 7 such mutations can fix in approximately 500,000 years. And that is 5 more mutations. And since the problem is geometric, 2 such mutations are trivial. And there is time for 12 7-mutation strings to fix in the human population, even if we assume the absurd and accept that the mutations that did occur to allow humans to evolve are the only such mutations that could have occurred and resulted in a species like modern humans.
So if any of those 120 million base pair differences in our DNA that encode many of the anatomical differences between humans and chimps represent a trait where they would just require 2 mutations before providing some advantage, it's virtually impossible that it could have evolved by unguided evolutionary mechanisms since we had our common ancestor with apes.
Kill me or release me, parasite. But do not waste my time with talk.
I have already addressed this. It is simply and completely wrong. It is rare that one can say that something has been conclusively disproved in science, but because this depends on the math of population genetics, the waiting time has been conclusively disproved with math. There is no such possibility that is a meaningful barrier to evolution, as it has been formulated by persons such as Behe, Sanford, and Carter.
What you're looking at right now is essentially a mathematical disproof that the human species had a strictly unguided evolutionary origin.
Or it would be if it actually made assumptions that actually reflected reality. Instead, it does the opposite. It is no surprise that when you lie about science, your lies can support incorrect conclusions. That is all that has happened here.
Humans are too genetically distinct compared to apes to have evolved by standard evolutionary mechanisms in the time allowed by the fossil record. A massive infusion of genetic information is needed, and that again implicates intelligent design.
But you may notice that he does not give an example of any particular such mutations. You see, by retreating to the waiting time argument, what Luskin has tacitly admitted is that nothing about the genome per se demands a supernatural origin. There are no mutations evident in the human genome that could not have occurred naturally. Instead, he has to pretend that while they could occur naturally, in principle, they simply could not have done so in enough time. This is because, fundamentally, if one wants to reject common ancestry at some point in biology, but accept it in other places, such as between all humans or even among all cats, it poses an obvious question. What stops the mechanisms that unite, say, all cats or all non-human apes, such that this common ancestry cannot run all the way to a most recent common universal ancestor, one that perhaps shares a name with one of Dapper's cousins? Well, there is no obvious answer. Mutations can be essentially anything, which means that given enough mutations, there is no obvious barrier that would prevent humans from sharing common ancestors with mushrooms, pine trees, and bacteria, never mind other apes. But if there is not enough time for the required mutations, then it requires some new mechanism. And Luskin assumes that he has opened a gap for his god to fit into, where before there was none. But since the waiting time is entirely made up, and based on obvious lies, such as that nature has specific targets, that mutations must fix in series rather than in parallel, and that sexual reproduction is unimportant to the question, the waiting time is simply not a barrier, and we are left with human common ancestry with chimpanzees being totally unproblematic for naturalistic mechanisms. But also, if his criteria were to be held consistently, then not only would humans and chimpanzees not have time to share common ancestry, but neither would rats and mice, or lions and tigers, because they are even more distinct genetically as pairs than chimpanzees and humans. But creationists rely on common ancestry to get them around problems of Noah's Ark. Now, I do not know if Luskin believes in a literal worldwide flood, but certainly many of his young Earth fans do, and they should know that this waiting time problem negates their biological flood models. And so they should not adopt it.
Okay, we'll wrap this up. We'll talk about human psychology.
Perhaps we can talk about the propensity of humans to simply make up lies in defense of their deeply held beliefs.
When you go to this famous hominid fossil museum in South Africa called the Maritime Museum, and you walk into their main fossil hall, there is this huge quote from Richard Dawkins stretching from floor to ceiling, and it says, "We are survival machines, robot vehicles blindly programmed to preserve the selfish molecules known as genes."
I hope I do not have to defend Richard Dawkins. Personally, I am willing to leave him to the flood.
Wow. What is this materialistic message? Simply put, it says that the purpose of human beings is nothing more than to survive and reproduce.
The purpose of human beings is for them to determine. Evolution cannot give them a purpose simply by being true, nor can it remove a purpose simply by being true. That humans are survival and reproduction machines is true in the same way that it is true that hitting certain uranium nuclei with neutrons of a certain energy will cause them to split apart. Those are just facts of the world. What someone does with these facts is a matter of philosophy. Science cannot tell you that you should have as many children as possible, or have none, or whether you should use nuclear fission to power a hospital or destroy a city. That is for you to decide. Science can only tell you the consequences of your choices. That is valuable information, vital, I would say. But ultimately, the choice remains yours. Find some value in your life, or embrace absurdism, or just enjoy what life you have. I cannot tell you what to do, but neither can Luskin.
We evolved, and we evolved to pass on our genes, nothing more and nothing less.
Casey is essentially saying that evolution, if true, leads to bioessentialism, that your biology and genetics absolutely determine your behavior. This is simply false. We can tell because identical twins do not make the same choices or have the same personality in all cases. Your destiny is not written in the stars or in your genes, and even if hard determinism is true, you still weigh options and make decisions. You get to do that also about your own behavior. Luskin has chosen to use his time on Earth to help in the oppression of innocent people whom he has never met while misinforming as many people as he can about science. I personally find that despicable and implore anyone listening to make a better choice.
What I want to ask right now when we look at human psychology is, does the evidence suggest that that is all we're here for, just to survive and reproduce and pass on our genes?
I would say no, but it is also tautological that humans exist because past humans were adept at survival and reproduction. So no matter what your purpose in life now, no matter what your choices around reproduction, the story of humanity involves much survival and much reproduction.
Now, evolutionary psychology claims that the human mind evolved on the African savanna and similar environments over the past 1 to 2 million years.
Evolutionary psychology is mostly unfalsifiable, just so stories, mostly invented to explain that the way humans currently act is how they have always and will always act. It is essentially right-wing propaganda wrapped in an illusory cloak of science. Really, it should be something Casey likes.
But if this is true, why do we have so many extraordinary abilities that seem to go far beyond what is needed to survive and reproduce in such environments?
Because cognitive abilities that evolved to support survival are not restricted to strictly survival tasks on the Paleolithic African savanna. Brains are flexible things and can adapt to new situations by using their abilities for new functions. As a hypothetical example, perhaps the ability to read is actually based on the ability of humans to see tracks in the ground, and from them, to consciously deduce information about species, health, and direction and speed of travel of the potential prey or predators. I am not saying that this is the case, but if humans had that ability, which they seem to have, then it seems plausible that the same brain might be able to associate certain markings with words more abstractly.
And so I'm going to defend a view called human exceptionalism. It's the view that the human race has unique and unparalleled moral, intellectual, and creative abilities.
Humans are unique only in degree, not in type. All the behaviors that we see humans engage in can be seen in other organisms, although they typically are not as sophisticated. Humans are at an extreme end of a spectrum of cognitive ability, but many other animals are closer to humans on that spectrum than I suspect Luskin would be comfortable with.
So what are some obvious, exceptional human qualities? Well, we have complex language.
Many primates have complex vocal and gestural communication systems, much of which are learned and not instinctual. Humans are simply more complex with their communication.
We use complex tools.
But chimpanzees make stone tools that are about as complicated as the oldest known stone tools associated with hominids, and we can trace the increase in complexity of these tools through time. Hominid archaeology clearly demonstrates that human tool making and tool use is an extension of the tool use of non-human apes.
We use fire.
Many animals use fire. Humans are unusual in their ability to start fires, but then again, that ability starts much earlier than the appearance of Homo sapiens and seems to be, again, an extension of ape tool-making capacity which precedes the evolution of hominids as a group.
We wear clothing.
That is just another extension of tool-making, a skill not unique to humans. Also, not all humans do wear clothing. I do not think that that makes humans who do not typically wear clothing subhuman.
Only humans can do abstract reasoning.
That does not seem to be the case. Other apes seem to be able to imagine solutions to puzzles in the abstract and then execute them first try successfully, such as puzzles about how to obtain food when tools are available that have to be used in certain ways. Even some birds may be capable of this.
We alone can do mathematics.
Well, first, this is ironic coming from a human who in this very talk showed that he seemingly cannot do mathematics. But second, basic math such as comparing amounts is actually something even dogs can do.
Only humans, all humans around the world, I don't care where you go, we all use music.
Many birds and cetaceans and even other apes seem to produce euphonic vocalizations, and in some birds the complexity of extemporaneous birdsong is itself used to attract mates, much like in the human music scene.
We compose poetry.
That is not separate from the general point about language.
We practice religion.
I would contend that religion is so ill-defined that it is meaningless to say that humans practice it. But animals can build up superstitious actions. For example, if a captive rat notices that the last time it performed a specific action it was fed, it will start to perform that action when it is hungry, even if it is on a strict feeding schedule, all because it seems to have a largely superstitious belief that that action induces humans to feed it. That is similar to at least certain things humans label religious, such as rain dances, prayer, and sacrificing for boons or to avoid tragedy.
And we use moral reasoning.
Monkeys are known to have a strong sense of fairness, and will object to different rewards given to other monkeys. They have a sense of generosity, and when allowed to choose either selfish or generous rewards for performing tricks, will pick the generous reward that also rewards members of their social circles quite frequently, and even more frequently when they know that they are being observed. They will also punish monkeys that give false alarm calls in order to access food first. If that is not a moral system, then it is not clear what moral systems are.
So there's many qualities that humans do that are found in no other species. We're clearly distinct from all other species.
Except that no such unique quality has been given. Humans have higher capacity in many of these fields, but there are other animals doing all of these things. In fact, even with the clothing, orcas in the northern Atlantic have been known to wear dead fish like hats, seemingly for decorative purposes. So it is not clear that only humans have behaviors like wearing clothing.
Bioethicist Wesley J. Smith, who I work with at Discovery Institute.
Once again, Luskin is willing to name a friendly source, while he routinely just gestures at indefinite sources when the source is not a friendly one, and is instead a pro-science source. This is the hallmark of a dishonest and dishonorable man.
He says, we are unquestionably a unique species, the only species capable of even contemplating ethical issues and assuming responsibilities.
That is clearly false. That is a common trait across a wide swath of primates.
We uniquely are capable of apprehending the difference between right and wrong, good and evil, proper and improper conduct.
And yet other primates enforce moral systems like humans do. Granted, they are less complex than human moral systems, but that is a matter of degree, not kind.
But I think that language is something that really distinguishes human beings because it makes us so different from all other species, and it allows us to engage in communication with each other, communicating all the kinds of complex ideas that our brains can imagine.
Human speech is indeed uniquely complex, but it is not unique in being a verbal communication system with rules of syntax. Other animals have such things. Now, I do not want to downplay how extraordinary the complexity of human language is. It is perhaps the thing humans can claim as a superpower among other life forms on Earth. It allows them to easily transfer learned information from one to another, facilitating technological advancement at a pace that seems ludicrous, especially for a species without easy access to advanced technology from previous species. But again, this is a difference of degree, not kind. No one is claiming that humans are not unique. If they were not, they would not be a species. But nothing about being superlative in the area of cognition is a problem for evolution in a way that being superlative in land speed or body length or visual acuity is not.
MIT professor and linguist Noam Chomsky, however, has said that human language appears to be a unique phenomenon. Without significant analog in the animal world, there is no reason to suppose that the gaps are bridgeable.
And yet Noam Chomsky does not reject human common ancestry with other apes. So of course this is cherry-picked. It is nice, though, that he has finally cited a hostile witness. Of course, Noam Chomsky's ideas have been having a bit of a rough time in linguistics, as it seems that linguists keep describing languages that seem to violate at least some of his ideas about universal grammar, reducing it to essentially the tautological fact that humans organize language in a way that is organized.
2014 paper authored by multiple prominent evolutionary scientists said that studies of non-human animals provide virtually no relevant parallels to human linguistic communication.
And another study in 2012 by multiple prominent creationists found that Casey Luskin has a grand total of 4 neurons in his head and an even lower number of glial cells. But this paper is The Mystery of Language Evolution by a large number of authors, including Noam Chomsky. And it is basically making the case that at least in 2014, there was little evidence of how humans went from much more basic verbal communication common to primates to the much more complex human-style language. While I disagree with the pessimism of the paper and their assessment of the gulf between general primate communication strategies and those of humans, we should remember that this is just Luskin finding a gap to toss his god into. Since language is a thing that happens in brains, and at least until writing is invented, in pressure waves in sound, 2 things which are generally not preserved in the fossil record, It should be no surprise that evolution of this capacity in humans is particularly poorly evidenced, especially compared to things like brain case size, technological sophistication, or migration patterns. Further, the paper is not at all skeptical of the capacity for evolution to produce what it calls the language phenotype, and singles out the gene FOXP2 for further investigation. And indeed, that gene is known to be linked to human speech and other advanced cognitive processes, and also exists in other animals including rodents, but not the human form of the gene. If, as the paper suggests, a language phenotype can be tied to that gene, then it means that mutation absolutely can account for human language. So, from a combination of misrepresenting a paper and a very evident paucity of evidence about an aspect of biology that more or less cannot be preserved, Luskin has found another gap to stick his God into. But the fact that something is unknown is not an argument that the cause must be God, or devils, or witches, or angels, or wizards.
The most fundamental questions about the origins and evolution of our linguistic capacity remain as mysterious as ever.
I mean, I disagree, but this is still just a continuation of the argument from ignorance. Think about this in the context of a murder investigation. A man was found dead in his house with a knife wound. There are signs of a struggle, and fingerprints from an unknown person which do not match any of the man's friends or family. There are also very distinct boot prints leading from the now smashed sliding door at the back of the house. There are also fibers under the man's fingernails which do not match any of his clothing. Later, on an unrelated charge, a woman is brought in for questioning and her house is searched. A knife is found with bloodstains matching the man's blood. Her phone is full of evidence that she and the murdered man have been meeting at a motel for an affair, but that he broke it off shortly before the estimated time of the murder, and the fibers from under the man's fingernails match fibers from a hoodie the woman owns. However, no boots are ever found that match the footprints. According to Luskin, this means that we should take seriously the possibility that actually the man was killed by a sorcerer who used magic to make it look like there were boots, and that the otherwise conclusive, overwhelming evidence of the woman's guilt is just a coincidence and a bunch of inexcusable hype from detectives. Even if biologists never adequately explain the origin of the so-called language phenotype, that will do nothing to overturn the overwhelming evidence for evolution as such, or human-chimp common ancestry in particular. In fact, even if some human god came down with trumpets, seated on the command throne of a forerunner dreadnought, and declared that he, or she, was directly responsible for human speech capacity, that would not negate human common ancestry with chimps. So even under the best case scenario for Luskin, this simply does not help his attempt to separate out humans from other monkeys.
And I love this quote from Harvard linguist Steven Pinker. He says, human language is an embarrassment for evolutionary theory because it is vastly more powerful than one can account for in terms of selective fitness.
Humans cover their homeworld like no other primate has ever done. They have conquered frozen wastes, humid jungles, oceanic islands, marshes, fens, dry deserts, mountain peaks, valleys lower than even the seas, and more. I would contend that this would be impossible without their ability to share complex information, which they do by means of language. I am very much not convinced that language is anything other than the greatest evolutionary advantage a primate has ever evolved. Humans are by far the most widespread and the most populous species of primate to have ever existed. Further, I should note that Pinker is an evolutionary psychologist, which means that he is in fact a pseudoscientist, at least some of the time. He was also a known associate of Jeffrey Epstein. It is not the time or place for a deep discussion of evolutionary psychology, but it mostly consists of untestable just-so stories that are used to justify sexism and argue in favor of bioessentialism. If you want more information, I would suggest asking Dapper's friend Dr. Dan Stern Cardinal. He will talk your strange, dried, fruit-shaped ears off about it.
And this is kind of the point that we're getting at here, that human beings have all these extraordinary abilities, and it's very difficult to understand why those abilities would evolve on the African savanna a million years ago.
Not really. Humans are less physically capable than basically any other great ape. They rely on each other in ways that few other animals do apart from animals like honeybees and ants. This requires the ability to interact meaningfully with a huge number of conspecifics in ways that are strongly pro-social and have a high chance of reciprocity. That is easier to do the smarter and better at communication one is. A huge part of the human adaptive strategy is teamwork. So humans adapt to their social environments just as much as their natural environment. Humans are even the leading culprit in animal-caused death among humans, being rivaled only by mosquitoes. It seems to me that the only way Luskin or Pinker can make this claim is by pretending that the human environment is of little consequence, when clearly it is perhaps the most consequential part of any human's environment. Think of your own life. What is more important to you? The weather or your loved ones and enemies? I would suggest that except in times of acutely bad weather, it is the humans in your life. Perhaps the fact that Casey can so easily dismiss the importance of community in human life and evolution explains his sociopathic drive to install fundamentally anti-human theocratic totalitarianism.
So, Who knows who these three people are? We all know who this is on the right. Who's that? Albert Einstein, able to ponder the deep workings of the universe through relativity. Michelangelo, I was just in Rome this last summer with my wife, and we went to the Sistine Chapel, and it's just incredible. It was overwhelming in the motion to see these incredible paintings that are bigger than life size, painted on the ceiling, telling the story of humanity in the Bible, and the artistic ability of Michelangelo is just incredible. Oskar Schindler, of course, was a famous German. He was not a Nazi, but he saved the lives of over 1,000 Jews.
Oskar Schindler was in fact a registered member of the Nazi Party. He was exceptional in that he opposed the genocidal plans of the regime and took illegal steps to protect his Jewish countrymen, and saved some 1,200 of them. But to say that he was not a Nazi is to overlook the complexity of the situation and what it took to be in business, or even just to be left relatively at peace in the Third Reich. The line between good and evil does not run through lines of party membership, and membership in various identities are about more than heartfelt belief. Sometimes it is about survival. Sometimes it is about tribalism. Sometimes it is just inertia. I would say that for Schindler it was about survival, as he joined the party the same year he acquired his factory. Further, it was his party membership and prior military espionage work on behalf of the Nazi regime that allowed him the connections he needed to keep his Jewish workers safe. An irony of history is that Schindler would not have been able to save his Jewish employees had he not been a Nazi.
From the gas chambers and from the concentration camps, basically risking his life for people who were not related to him. He had no evolutionary reason to risk his life to save those Jews.
Prosociality is likely to at least first evolve as a matter of kin selection, so that such risks are only taken to preserve those closely related to oneself, because they also carry one's genes. But as human social groups grew larger than kin groups, prosociality became adaptive outside close kin. Further, the moral progress of human cultures has largely been about expanding the moral franchise farther and farther away from kin groups by including more and more humans as appropriate recipients of prosocial behavior, piggybacking on the fact that prosociality is adaptive once you have a complex and large enough social structure, something early humans seem to have had. But further, Luskin seems to be falling into the trap that evolution being true means that bioessentialism is too. Those are not ideas that rise and fall together. Your genes are not the sole determinant of who you are, and you can overcome instinctual behaviors and do things that you find important, even if from the standpoint of evolution, they may lead to lower fitness.
So I love this quote. We can criticize Francis Collins, but this is actually a good quote. He says, what we admire as the most generous manifestations of altruism are not based on kin selection or reciprocity. An extreme example might be Oskar Schindler risking his life to save more than 1,000 Jews from the gas chambers.
But the fact that his particular act of altruism may not have been likely to receive reciprocity does not mean that altruism did not evolve because reciprocity made it fitness enhancing. Also, I will point out that Schindler did in fact receive reciprocity and spent the later parts of his life financially supported by the Schindler Juden, that is, the people whom he saved from the Nazis. That being said, it is true that the human capacity for altruism is exceptional and demands a more detailed explanation, and there are real scientists working on it, just like there are on the question of how human language evolved. What won't help that investigation is just throwing one's hands in the air and deciding that it must have been magic, and it is best not to look into it.
That's the opposite of saving his genes. So there are many behaviors that humans do that I think would show no evolutionary benefit.
The fact that a particular behavior is not always beneficial does not mean it is not beneficial overall. For example, deer have a reflex to freeze when they detect danger. This makes them harder for most predators to find. And while they are frozen, they are hyper-alert to their surroundings, and when the source of their alarm is located, they can flee rapidly. This is a very good strategy for avoiding death from predators such as big cats or wolves. It is not so good at avoiding death by car, though. So, does the fact that some deer freeze on the road and then get hit by cars make the freeze response inexplicable by evolution? No, of course not. It is just that a broadly adaptive behavior may not work out in some specific circumstances. It is quite possible that that is what is going on with human altruism. It may well be that it is broadly beneficial for most humans most of the time, but then it can harm some humans' fitness some of the time. That does not make altruism maladaptive on the whole. Another amusing example is that some birds can be induced to brood egg-shaped rocks. Clearly, this does not help them spread their genes, but the brooding instinct as a whole does in general. So even if it sometimes goes awry, it is not maladaptive.
Why would we need the ability to discover relativity if all you have to do is survive and reproduce, in some ancient environment? Painting the Sistine Chapel, composing symphonies, why is that needed?
It is not. It is a cognitive chin. Let me explain. The human chin is so distinctive it is a diagnostic criterion for your species. Yet it has essentially no function. It is simply connected genetically in various ways to things that are adaptive. Essentially, it just tagged along when other things were being selected for. Similarly, cognitive abilities that are needed for survival sometimes are capable of doing things that do not directly apply to survival. This is not unique to humans. Orcas wearing dead fish on their heads does not help with their survival. Chimpanzees putting straw behind their ears did not help with their survival. Yet these things are known to occur, because cognitive complexity, once it exists, can be used for non-survival based activities, and as long as those activities are not too risky, that is not a problem for evolution.
Celibacy, usually very bad for reproduction.
Well, technically, celibacy refers to not being married, while chastity refers to not engaging in sexual acts. One can be chaste and married, or celibate and unchaste, but I will also admit that at least traditionally in Christian cultures, celibacy and chastity are supposed to go together.
Extreme acts of selflessness that put one's life at risk, especially for people outside of your own kin. And I want to take this to the next level. Willingly dying for your enemies and loving them as they kill you. Think of Jesus dying on the cross, okay? There's no evolutionary explanation for why a man like Jesus, who of course was also God, would die on the cross for all of his enemies.
Of course, there is no scientific basis for saying that the incarnation is real, so if you believe in it as a miracle, I fail to see why you would want to find scientific justification for the acts of the incarnate Son of God. That seems like a fool's errand.
What's also interesting about this is not just that Jesus did it, but when you talk to people all around the world, I don't care if they're a Christian or a non-Christian, everybody looks at what Jesus did and sees it as the most beautiful expression of human morality, that you would willingly sacrifice your life for the lives of others, even for your enemies, okay?
I know very many people who would vehemently disagree, so it is not everyone. But why does this matter? Why would Luskin think that he needs a naturalistic explanation for an explicitly supernatural series of events? He could be completely right about Jesus, but then Jesus' behavior would provide no evidence either way about evolution, because his behavior is fundamentally not something that is open to scientific examination or explanation if Luskin is right. That means it should not factor into any scientific investigation.
So what's interesting is that there seems to be this universal moral code throughout humanity which values, respects, and praises these behaviors above all others. And we see these behaviors among all humans. All humans are capable of doing incredible intellectual, artistic, musical, and moral feats.
An obligately social species doing pro-social things is not exactly unexpected or a good reason to abandon science.
That just make us stand in awe. Why is it not only that we can do those things, but we hold those behaviors above all others?
Because prosociality is broadly adaptive, even if we can come up with examples where it was not. We are back to the deer in the headlights problem.
That is the exact opposite of what evolution would produce if supposedly it's just programming us to pass on our genes, okay?
No, it is not okay. It is simply a lie. Selfishness can be maladaptive. This is not a new idea in evolutionary biology, or particularly controversial, and ignoring it just means that Casey is ignoring science, making him a pseudoscientist.
So what this shows us is that life is about more than just survival and reproduction.
That is a choice humans are free to make.
This challenges Darwinism, and it suggests that humanity was designed for higher purposes.
No, it does not, but I have already explained why that is. I will not go over it again here.
So the next time somebody tries to break down the differences between humans and apes, remind them that it's humans who write scientific papers studying apes and not the other way around.
Except that humans are apes, and so when a human writes a scientific paper about humans, it is in fact an ape writing a paper about a human. But that is all he had, lies on top of lies. I do not know why I agreed to do this. This was like trying to get a Kigyar to stop stealing. Fruitless and frustrating. Dapper now owes me. Anyway, if you like this rather unusual video, please hit like. If you did not, then hit dislike and explain your displeasure in the comments. I have been Koronazami Gadavra, filling in for Dapper Dinosaur. Haituka Kudo.
Hey, before you leave, I just want to take a second to thank my patrons and channel members, especially those pledging $20 or above. Benthovend, Thurgevara, Tapioca Weasel, Whispers, Eleron Teller, Ian Chen, Kelvin Brostick Van Manen, Landon Knoll, Mabdy Babdy, Wallace, Max Cherry, North Texas Fossils, John Ackerman, and Strawberry Vein. It's because of my channel members and patrons whom you're seeing on screen that this channel can stay afloat. Without you, it would all shut down. If you want to join the team, there's a link to join the channel below this video, and there's a link to join the Patreon in the description. On the Patreon, you can get a 10% discount for pledging annually, and either way, you get early access to virtually all of my scripted videos, often 3 to 5 months before they come out for the general public. Thanks for watching.